Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, and thank you once again for coming back onto our weekly live stream. I feel a little bigger than usual, or maybe this just might be the way I'm looking at it, but hopefully, all of you are getting me clear in HD. I wanted to I'm going to give a kind of a brief introduction here because I want to just say this at the top of the program. I do want all of you to be able to tune in at 7 o'clock. My friend Diane Sayre, she's doing a great webinar on the TLO YouTube channel. I'm saying that here at the top of the show because we are going to do our best to be over by then because I want you to join that. So that's going to be at 7 o'clock. And I'm gonna see. I've only done this once before, but I'm gonna see if I can try to make this stream contiguous to that stream. I think the case that it's possible, so that you don't have to switch off to watch that. But in the case that you can't, you can go onto the LaRouche Organization YouTube channel and you can watch more of Diane there. She's doing a special presentation with Tony Chaikin, and it's going to be a great presentation. Now, with that being said, I just want to give a very quick sort of recap here. Spring is now sprung. It's finally getting warmer here in the streets of the Bronx, the streets of the United States. People are feeling a little more hopeful and a little more optimistic. And I know that that's kind of strange to say given the political turbulence happening right now, but I don't know if people got the report that there may have been a cabinet meeting where people like Tulsi Gabbard, Pete Hegseth, and JD Vance all warned against going to war with Iran and told the Israelis not to follow through with their so-called decapitation strike. Now, we can talk about that being the effects of the people in the cabinet. We can say good things about, Tulsi Gabbard. I don't know if I have anything good to say about Pete Hegseth and JD Vance, but quite frankly, I think this is a process that we began here. And when I say we, I mean the people who watch this stream, the people who are a part of our organization, and people who are generally mobilized to prevent there to be war with Iran. It is because you were vocal. It is because you decided to stand up against the injustice and you decided to stand up against the incoming, what seemed to be almost inevitable war, the game of death. It's because of all of you that we may have temporarily averted war with Iran. So, but what is the further solution? And that was something that was discussed today on the International Peace Coalition call between Alex Kreiner and Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Now, you may know the name Alex Kreiner because you may have seen him. Maybe you follow his work. He's been, a longtime blogger. He did something with Glenn Deason last week talking about the incoming BRICS and the end of American-led globalization, and he was able to expand on that and what that exactly means. And we had some brilliant interventions from people like Dennis Small and Helga Zepp-LaRouche, which led to a very fruitful dialogue. It's not just letting the American empire collapse, not at all, because we're approaching the 250th anniversary or birthday of our country. And if you let the so-called globalists, the so-called oligarchs define that history, then yeah, America is a genocidalist party of imperialism that, never left its British roots. But I don't believe that. I know that that is not the case of what America is. America is you. And you have to ask yourself, are you an imperialist, genocidal war monger? I don't think you are, not just because you happen to watch our weekly streams, but because I know that you're somebody who wants to fight for what's right. So if that is you, then you are America. So what responsibility comes with that? So that's what I'll say, and I'll set the stage now for Dennis. Dennis, I'm going to bring you up on the screen now.
Right.
Great. There you are.
Okay, so here's what we're going to do tonight. We began the discussion of Poe's Purloined Letter. We did read it last week. What we're going to do this week is we are going to discuss why we are doing this discussion, and we are going to, I'll also just reference that the presentation, there's a historian by the name of Anton Chaikin, very well known to many of us. I've known Tony for 50 years now, and he just finished a book, the second volume of a book entitled who we are. Uh, Jose just talked about whom we are not, but Tony tries to get at what the identity of the American nation is. That is a good thing to discuss in the era of what people call identity politics, which I would call lack of identity politics. But what we did last week was we read the story, and the story is the way Poe's chosen method of addressing matters of great importance. But what I'm going to do first is reference a document written many years ago now, almost 50 years ago. And this was written by Lyndon LaRouche. And he was writing the document at the time that our associate and friend Alan Salisbury, who was author of a book called The Civil War and the American System, America's Battle with Britain. This book, and this is Alan Salisbury's picture on the back, this book was the book that brought back into focus in the 1976, 77, 78 period, the idea of what's called the American system. The American system is a specific school of not merely economic practice, but of scientific practice in the area of what's called physical economy. And it is the basis upon which the American Revolution was consolidated. It is not capitalism as people think about with respect to particularly Adam Smith. It is the opposite of Adam Smith. It is not communism as people think about Karl Marx. In fact, the primary author that Alan Salisbury discusses here, Henry Charles Carey, who authored many books on the American system, was the employer of Karl Marx at the New York Tribune. Marx didn't come here, he was in London, but he wrote a regular economics column for the New York Tribune, and Carey, or periodic column, I should say, and Carey engaged in several disputes with Marx, particularly on the question of the proletariat, the notion of an immiserated working class, which was being given the same name as that of the dispossessed of Rome, the proletariat. And Carey objected to that and stated that there was no necessity for what Marx was referring to as class warfare. Carey substituted for that an idea of what he called the harmony of interest. And he asserted that he believed that that was the product of the work, successful work, of Alexander Hamilton in the creation of the American Treasury, Hamilton being the first Secretary of the Treasury, and the practice of the American system as defined by four revolutionary documents, revolutionary as in American revolutionary documents: the report on manufactures, the report on public credit, the report on the national bank, and the report on the constitutionality of the bank. And that is essentially what really established not the United States as an independent nation. Of course, the Declaration of Independence and the federal Constitution did that, but from the standpoint of the longevity of the republic, and from the standpoint of the revolutionary capability of the republic, it was that conception of economics that was implemented by a government comprised of the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the actual commander-in-chief, George Washington, and a colonel, Alexander Hamilton, a subsidiary of a military subsidiary of Washington. Nobody really thinks about the first presidency that way, but that's what it was. It was essentially the people that had conducted the revolution successfully and militarily successfully. There were others that were also later became president, like James Monroe, who was also a military officer, wounded at the Battle of Trenton, who also became president, the fifth president of the United States. So that's what we are looking at now. Now, what I'm going to put up on the screen is there was a project that Alan Salisbury began. He was looking at Edgar Poe, and we'll just put up on the screen something from Lyndon LaRouche, who was describing a discussion that he had with Alan Salisbury and another researcher, Pam Lowry. Lowry is the wife of Graham Lowry, who also wrote a very important, a decisively important book on the American Revolution, which we'll show after this, called How the Nation Was Won. And so this is 1978. And Lynn LaRouche is saying this. I was struck by the efficiency of this connection in the course of my current participation as a working advisor in a project chiefly developed by Alan Salisbury and Pam Lowry. Salisbury, whose current specialized researches are focused on the American Federalist Whig movement of the pre-1865 period, was agreeably startled to discover Poe among the important political collaborators of Henry Charles Carey, John Quincy Adams, who was the President of the United States from 1825 to 1829, and others. And for this and other reasons, Salisbury undertook a work on Poe to follow his recently completed study of Carey. Pam Lowry is currently completing a key working paper on crucial phases of the overall undertaking. Salisbury drew me into the ongoing effort at various points, and more recently, my duties in this connection have been increased as the time approaches for settling some crucial matters of evaluation. It was in this latter connection that I was struck forcibly by the extraordinary usefulness of the Poe case for exposing most directly the enormity and treasonous implications of the corruption of current liberal arts notions of scholarly practice. Now, let's pause for a minute. Let me just show How the Nation Was Won. This is the book that was written by historian Graham Lowry, also a member of our organization. And this book completely upends the entire narrative of the American Revolution. The period that the book covers is from 1630 to 1754. And of course, the American Revolution is not until 1775. In fact, today and tomorrow, are the 250th anniversary of the official opening of hostilities between the American colonists and the British Crown. So this is a good time to take this theme up. In Graham's book, I'll just also say that Pam Lowry, who was just aforementioned, wrote or was the consultant who wrote many of the street signs that are still up in Boston to this day that describe the various battles and historical sites in Boston for the American Revolution. Going back now to the text from LaRouche, he said, yet by the very fact of reaching those most essential conclusions, Salisbury, Lowry, and I have opened up exciting new dimensions of further investigation respecting the early 19th century Whig conspiracies and their international connections. What we are already in the process of discovering concerning Poe's life would excite the pleasure of the Poe within his Dupin, referring to the protagonist in the story that we read last week, the Purloined Letter, to which we will also refer in a moment. It is already clear that the continuing filling in of the jigsaw puzzle pieces opens up to us an entire new dimension of historical research into American life during the first half of the last century. This was, of course, written in 1978. So he's talking about the first half of the 1800s, from 1800 to 1850. So let's just summarize, therefore, what we're now saying. We're saying that there is one book called How the Nation Was Won, which completely upends the story of how people think the United States was founded, the idea of the British roots of the United States, which is not actually accurate. This would be a useful book for J.D. Vance to read, who was asserting that the United States is an Anglo nation. It is not, for many different reasons, but one of the things that is done by Graham's book is that he makes it very, very clear the role of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who's a German from Hanover, but one of the greatest scientists. In fact, the inventor of the calculus, which was not Newton, and probably the most suppressed scientific name of recent history. Neil deGrasse Tyson and others would be quite upset by our assertions, though they would try to ridicule them, that it is not Isaac Newton, who is, quote, the greatest mind of ever, as Neil deGrasse Tyson likes to say it, but in fact, that it was Gottfried Leibniz, who did not only founded calculus, but was the founder of what's called physical economy. When in 1672, at the age of 26, he wrote an essay called Society and Economy. And I will remind you in a moment of Poe's interest in references to Leibniz. But what we're going to do right now is read the beginning of the Purloined Letter to remind you of where we were in just last week. And I'll just read that beginning, and then we'll return to these matters that we are indicating about Poe as a part of an intelligence conspiracy. So the story, the Purloined Letter, begins with a quote, which is in Latin: "Nil sapientia odiosius acumine nimio." Nothing is more hateful to wisdom than too much cleverness. And then it does the following. It says, "At Paris, just after dark, one gusty evening in the autumn of 18, I was enjoying the twofold luxury of meditation and a meerschaum." That's a pipe. You know, it's a particular, it's not a clay pipe, it's a different material. In company with my friend C. Auguste Dupin in his little back library or book closet, and then he gives the address. For 1 hour at least, we had maintained a profound silence, while each, to any casual observer, might have seemed intently and exclusively occupied with the curling eddies of smoke that oppressed the atmosphere of the chamber. For myself, however, I was mentally discussing certain topics which had formed matter for conversation between us at an earlier period of the evening. I mean the affair of the Rue Morgue and the mystery attending the murder of Marie Roget. Now, the setting we have here is that he says we're in his little back library or book closet. You think about it as having a bunch of bookshelves like the ones behind me, but think about the idea that there's a room. Well, almost you could think of this room that way, and it's essentially a closet. It's not a large room, and they're sitting in there and they're smoking pipes, and they haven't spoken for an hour. And what they're discussing without talking is they're discussing two other stories, which we have not yet read in this series: the murders in the Rue Morgue and the mystery of Marie Roget. So he says, "I looked upon it, therefore, as something of a coincidence when the door of our apartment was thrown open and admitted our old acquaintance, Monsieur G, the prefect of the Parisian police." This refers to the fact that he's first introduced. The prefect is first introduced in the story, the Purloined Letter. I'm sorry, in the story, the murders in the Rue Morgue earlier. And then they go on. "We gave him a hearty welcome, for there was nearly half as much of the entertaining as of the contemptible about the man, and we had not seen him for several years. We had been sitting in the dark, and Dupin now arose for the purpose of lighting a lamp, but sat down again without doing so upon G's saying that he had called to consult us, or rather to ask the opinion of my friend about some official business which had occasioned a great deal of trouble. If it is any point requiring reflection, observed Dupin, as he forbore to enkindle the wick, we shall examine it to better purpose in the dark. That is another of your odd notions, said the prefect, who had a fashion of calling everything odd that was beyond his comprehension, and thus lived amid an absolute legion of oddities. We're going to pause there, and I want to now refer to let me have the next reading from LaRouche, going on to something additional. So remember this picture of Dupin and the narrator, whose name were never given, and the prefect. They're all in the room, and it's dark, and there are two pipes basically, and there's eddies of smoke, so it's actually almost opaque. So I will go to where, okay, let me get that. Where I disagree. Okay, I'll just read it from here. Where I disagree with Poe, this is LaRouche speaking, I have fought out the same methodological issues and related judgments during my adolescence and young adulthood, and also with reference to the standpoint of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Leibniz's allies. If I differ with Poe on various specific matters of this sort of, that is, of method, the method of inquiry, method of thinking, the difference is between two persons of the same species of spirit. In some respects, it must be added, my own significant advantages over Poe involve the fact that I am now 55 years of age, whereas he was cut off, most probably murdered, at the age of 40. These advantages also reflect my good fortune in developing the position I currently enjoy, intellectual and related resources far beyond anything Poe was provided in his time. Now, let me say what this refers to. Lyndon LaRouche, who died in 2019, 6 years ago, and it was 55 years ago at the time of this writing, which was, of course, 53 years ago, is what was born in 1922. So he was, when he was 40 years old, it was 1962. 1962, while Lyndon LaRouche had done important work in areas concerning the issue of intelligence and with respect to mathematical physics and geometry in specific, working with the ideas of Bernhard Riemann and Georg Cantor, two important figures in physics, particularly Riemann, who was basically sort of the precursor of relativity theory. Einstein's relativity theory is largely a product of the working through of various of the ideas of Riemann. But in 1962, Lyndon LaRouche had written, I think, the second of his forecasts, which was called Depression Ahead. But if he were to have died in 1962, I mean, basically, there almost everything that he became known for, and almost every way in which he was able to perfect the work that he had done earlier, came after that point. So when he says what he says concerning seeing Poe, my own significant advantages over Poe involve the fact that I am now 55 years old, whereas he was cut off, most probably murdered at the age of 40. That's why he's referring to that. I'm just referring to that passage. It's okay. We don't need that slide. I actually want to go to the next one because it will, and let's go past that one to the next one. Because I want to reference this issue of Leibniz. And I also want to reference what we just heard from the Purloined Letter. So this is from the man of the crowd. You'll remember it if you were with us when we read this story before. Not long ago, about the closing in of an evening in autumn, I sat at the large bow window of the D Coffee House in London. Remember, our first setting is Paris. This setting is London. For some months, I had been ill in health, but was now convalescent, and with returning strength, found myself in one of those happy moods which are so precisely the converse of ennui, that's boredom. Moods of the keenest appetency, that means the keenest appetite. When the film from the mental vision departs, they have it. They don't put the text in there. The Greek text. What is that? Hold on. I'm sorry. I didn't realize they had that. Well, let me just read. And the intellect electrified surpasses as greatly its everyday condition as the vivid yet candid reason of Leibniz, the mad and flimsy rhetoric of Gorgias. Gorgias was a sophist of the period of Socrates of the 4th century, who believed, among other things, that nothing exists. And even if something does exist, you can't prove that it exists. And even if you could prove it exists, you can't communicate it. I mean, he believed a lot of other things, but that was sort of, he was called the founder of the school of nihilism. That's the kind of thing it said about it. But what's relevant here is, what Poe's getting at is that the state of mind in which he is about to conduct a certain investigation, which he then describes, is completely the opposite of the state of mind that the sophist or the cynic finds himself in. And so this is important because when the prefect comes in, he expresses something very different. Now, I need a couple of readers just so we can get this passage done. And then, so if we have probably, I think we need probably 3 readers. We have 3 people?
Yeah, we have 3 people. You want to read? All right. Come up, Kynan and Lynn.
I need a Dupin and I need a prefect. I think that Kynan, why don't you be Dupin and let Lynn be the prefect?
Okay.
And then Jose, you can be the narrator. He only has a couple lines, but we're not going to go that far anyway. We're just going to give it to this.
Okay, I got the Purloin letter pulled up here. And everyone has a copy. Where are we starting is the question.
Let's start where he says, if it is any point requiring reflection.
Okay, so we have a Dupin. I'll be the narrator. Nathan,
No,
you can.
Well, you're going to be the voice of the narrator because he speaks a couple times. I'll be the narrator.
Oh, you'll be the narrator. I'll be the voice of the narrator. Oh, there's 3. Right. There's 3.
Right.
Here. You can drop out. I'll let Nathan be. You can be Dupin, and then you'll be the prefect, Lynn. Okay. Yeah, you'll see it.
So you would read this part, and then the narrator comes in, and then you read again.
Okay, very good, very good.
No problem. Okay, so I guess you start if it is.
If it is any point requiring reflection,
observed Dupin as he forbore to enkindle the wick,
we shall examine it to better purpose in the dark.
This is another of your odd notions,
said the prefect, who had a fashion of calling everything odd that was beyond his comprehension, and thus lived amid an absolute legion of oddities.
Very true,
said Dupin, as he supplied his visitor with a pipe and rolled towards him a very comfortable chair.
And what is the difficulty now?
I asked.
Nothing more in the assassination way, I hope.
Oh, no, nothing of that nature. The fact is, the business is very simple indeed. I make no doubt that we can manage it sufficiently well ourselves, but then I thought Dupin would like to hear the details of it because it is so excessively odd.
Simple and odd,
said Dupin.
Why, yes, and not exactly that either. The fact is, we have all been a good deal puzzled because the affair is so simple and yet baffles us altogether.
Perhaps it is the very simplicity of the thing which puts you at fault,
said my friend.
What nonsense you do talk,
replied the prefect, laughing heartily.
Perhaps the mystery is a little too plain,
said Dupin.
Oh, good heavens! Who ever heard of such an idea?
A little too self-evident.
Ha ha ha! Ha ha ha! Ho ho ho!
roared out our visitor, profoundly amused.
Oh, Dupin, you will be the death of me yet.
And what, after all, is the matter on hand?
I asked,
Well, I will tell you.
replied the prefect as he gave a long, steady, and contemplative puff and settled himself in his chair.
I will tell you in a few words, but before I begin, let me caution you that this is an affair demanding the greatest secrecy, and that I should most probably lose the position I now hold were it ever known that I had confided it to anyone.
Proceed.
Said I,
Or not.
said Dupin.
Well, then, I have received personal information from a very high quarter that a certain document of the last importance has been purloined from the royal apartments. The individual who purloined it is known. This beyond a doubt. He was seen to take it. It is known also that it still remains in his possession.
How is this known?
I asked Dupin,
It is clearly inferred
replied the prefect.
from the nature of the document and from the non-appearance of certain results which would at once arise from its passing out of the robber's possession. That is to say, from his employing it as he must design in the end to employ it.
Be a little more explicit.
I said,
Well, I may venture so far as to say that the paper gives its holder a certain power in a certain quarter where such power is immensely valuable.
the prefect was fond of the cant of diplomacy,
Still, I do not quite understand.
said Dupin.
No. Well, the disclosure of the document to a third person, who shall be nameless, would bring in question the honor of a personage of most exalted station. And this fact gives the holder of the document an ascendancy over the illustrious personage whose honor and peace are so jeopardized.
But this ascendancy
I interposed.
would depend upon the robber's knowledge of the loser's knowledge of the robber. Who would dare? Zulin.
The thief
Said G,
is the minister D, who dares all things, those unbecoming as well as those becoming a man. The method of the theft was not less ingenious than bold. The document in question, a letter to be frank, has been received by the personage robbed while alone in the royal boudoir. During its perusal, she was suddenly interrupted by the entrance of the other exalted personage, from whom especially it was her wish to conceal it. After a hurried and vain endeavor to thrust it in a drawer, she was forced to place it, open as it was, upon a table. The address, however, was uppermost, and the contents thus unexposed. The letter escaped notice. At this juncture enters the minister D. His lynx eye immediately perceives the paper, recognizes the handwriting of the address, observes the confusion of the personage addressed, and fathoms her secret. After some business transactions, hurried through in his ordinary manner, he produces a letter somewhat similar to the one in question, opens it, pretends to read it, and then places it in close juxtaposition of the other. Again, he converses for some 15 minutes upon the public affairs. At length, in taking leave, he takes also from the table the letter to which he had no claim. Its rightful owner saw, but of course dared not call attention to the act in the presence of the third personage who stood at her elbow. The minister decamped, leaving his own letter, one of no importance, upon the table.
Here then,
said Dupin to me.
you have precisely what you demand to make the ascendancy complete. The robber's knowledge of the loser's knowledge of the robber.
Okay, we'll
Yeah.
stop there. We'll stop there. Now, so what we now know is we have a story in which the criminal is known, the criminal act is known, the victim knows who committed the crime, and the prefect of police knows who's committed the crime, and the nature of the crime is known, the object taken is known,
Mm.
and the placement of the object is known, but the story involves the fact that the object cannot be found. And so that's the setting. That's what the ostensible setting is. Okay, let's go back now to the next offering from LaRouche.
This is now the
It's not the is not stunning. It's the one before that, which we didn't do, I believe. In the course of my discussions of Poe.
Got it. Coming up.
Yes, this is it. Okay. Now, before I read this, let me remind people that Poe last lived in the Bronx, and his wife and mother were living up there, and I believe that's where they also died. Early in the course of my discussions of Poe with Alan Salisbury, I found myself voicing the concept that sprang forcibly into my mind. Poe was certainly some sort of intelligence operative working at a high level in the United States' interest. Salisbury replied with some facts which coincided with that judgment. The hypothesis soon gained the quality of a certainty. The basis for the original hypothesis was that there are outstanding features of Poe's work, including his selection of adversaries, which could not have prevailed as they did unless Poe were governing his post-1831 literary efforts by overriding intelligence/professional concerns. On this basis, I proposed that further investigations concentrate on the circumstances surrounding Poe's separation from West Point, to the purpose of determining the nature of the official or private form of the intelligence organization for which Poe was in fact a leading operative. Now, here's what we are going to do. What we're going to do is we're going to entertain this as an hypothesis, and we're not going to attempt to try to get at this merely through this story, although there is something I want to offer because I think people have to hear it in preparation for next week's class, and in preparation for what you are about to be able to hear from historian Anton Chaikin. It's the following. The founding of West Point, the military academy at West Point, which Poe attended, was the product of the intent of the soldiers and army of the American Revolution to preserve and to expand the intelligence capabilities that they had created that had defeated the British in the first place, because the Americans had developed an intelligence capacity far in excess of the British before the revolution even happened. Let me repeat that. The people of the American Revolution, the Sons of Liberty, and the conspirator, particularly known as Benjamin Franklin, had devised and developed an intelligence capability that far outstripped and outweighed British intelligence. And British intelligence, or that is as formally, the creation of British intelligence was created in a reaction to the American Revolution. So for all of those that have unfortunately grown up on the premise that British intelligence was superior to American intelligence, the opposite was the case. And it has been the case that since 1782, when British intelligence was sort of, just say, officially created at Chatham House, there were British intelligence operatives before that. Of course, people had spies going back to whenever you want to choose to take. Back before there was a Britain, there were spies. But we're talking about the British secret intelligence services, which were created to try to avoid what happened in the American Revolution ever happening again. And the secret to the present conditions of America is the fact that that British intelligence service has made its life's mission the destruction of the United States. That is why the United States often adopts policies that are against the interests of the United States. That's why people find themselves stating over and over, several times a day, this policy is crazy. Who would want to do this? Why are we doing this tariff policy? It's hurting us. Why are we going to Afghanistan? What's the purpose of that? We sent $2 trillion in Afghanistan, and then the Taliban took over again. Well, before we got there, they had eliminated opium. And then when we got there, 90% of the world's opium was grown in Afghanistan while we were there, losing $2 trillion plus people. And then when we left, the Taliban came back. Why did we do that? Oh, Iraq. Oh, well, there were no weapons of mass destruction. And then we ended up just destroying this country. What did we gain? Oil? Well, we didn't really gain oil. We had oil before that. Why do we do these things? How come we did this thing in Ukraine? We just lost a war to Russia, which, by the way, will now become more increasingly clear. There was no proxy war in Ukraine. There was a war between NATO, led by the United States, on Russia, and the Americans and NATO lost. And that is what happened. That's what just happened in the last 2 years. Almost having a nuclear war in the process. That's not admitted. That's not said. The reason for this is because the primary conflict globally is between Great Britain and the United States, and the Americans are too dumb to know it. Now, that's an assertion by me. So I'm not asking you to accept that. But the reason we're looking at this is it possible that this business, this thing that's proposed here, is true? I mean, I would not accept these words from Lyndon LaRouche as true. That is to say, I say that you take it as an hypothesis. As I said, the hypothesis soon gained the quality of a certainty, but I found myself voicing the concept that sprang forcibly into my mind. Poe was certainly some sort of intelligence operative working at a high level in the U.S. interest. The historian Anton Chaikin has looked at this extensively. I have this sense that he will be speaking about, he'll allude to this at least, tonight. And I want to make sure that people get a chance to hear that. Let's go to the final reference from LaRouche, because it's a reference directly to the story. Purloined Letter. And those of you who were here last week will remember this section. Let me see if I may be able to locate that. Excuse me, I lost my place. And read that section because you're going to want to know what he's referring to. I got it. Thank you. Sorry about this. Okay. Now, last week we read a section of the story which seemed to come out of nowhere. This is after Dupin had, given the prefect the letter. He found the letter. I'm not going to read the entire section, but there is a section of the story in which Dupin says, "In short, I never yet encountered the mere mathematician who could be trusted out of his equal roots." Equal roots means quadratic equations. "Or one who did not clandestinely hold it as a point of his faith that x squared plus px was absolutely and unconditionally equal to q. Say to one of these gentlemen, by way of experiment, if you please, that you believe occasions may occur where x squared plus px is not altogether equal to q, and having made him understand what you mean, get out of his reach as speedily as convenient, for beyond doubt he will endeavor to knock you down." Now, don't worry about whether you are hearing that passage for the first time, you don't know what it refers to. What I will tell you is that if you, quote, Google the Purloined Letter mathematics, what will come up is a series of very angry people, not a series, but a few very angry people will tell you that Poe had no understanding of mathematics. And he's just putting this in, and he's making a big assertion in the story about how mathematicians can't are inferior to poets. That's fundamentally what he basically says. What happens is that it gets established that the thief has a brother. And the narrator says there are two brothers, and both have attained reputation in letters. The minister, who is the thief, I believe, has written learnedly of the differential calculus. He is a mathematician and no poet. So that's what the narrator is saying. But then Dupin says, you are mistaken. I know him well. He is both. As both poet and mathematician, he would reason well. As poet, profoundly. As mere mathematician, he could not have reasoned at all, and thus would have been at the mercy of the prefect. And then the narrator responds by saying, you surprise me by these opinions which have been contradicted by the voice of the world. You do not mean to set at naught the well-digested idea of centuries. The mathematical reason has long been regarded as the reason par excellence. And then Dupin responds saying, it's a good bet that every public idea, every received convention is foolish, since it appeals to the majority. And he goes on and talks about why he thinks mathematics is inferior to poetry. Let's put up the slide, please. Leave it up. This is what LaRouche says. He says, it is stunning, but not surprising, that Poe's notion of scientific method should be essentially identical with that of G.B. Riemann, as Bernard Riemann, and the transfinite notions of Georg Cantor, who was a different mathematician and physicist. All three shared a common direct debt to the work of Gottfried Leibniz, in which these issues of scientific method are developed to the point of ripeness for the relativistic physics of Riemann. Poe emphasizes, for example, that the equation x squared plus px equal q may not always hold, even though it previously appears to have been proven for the overwhelming number of ordinary cases. This is not Heisenberg-like irrationalism, not some Stoic derivation. It is the principle otherwise associated with Riemann, that at the extremities of a physical function, think about astrophysics, for example, or microphysics, right? The extraordinarily large or the extraordinarily small, that at the extremities of a physical function, there arise crucial phenomena which not only violate the ordinary rule for that function, but in which crucial exceptions are the access to higher manifolds of physical reality, higher orders of human knowledge of physical reality. This is otherwise very modern, high temperature plasma physics. Now, I'm reading that to you not because that's an explanation. We are not. Next week, what we are going to do is to investigate this, because this is the core of the story, and Poe is arguing this is the core of his intelligence method. Okay, so we were destined to get here at some point in all of the readings, and I realize that people have had different experiences in the readings, but this has become unavoidable given what is happening out in the world right now, and given the fact that people are having such a hard time understanding it, when in fact, if you look at it from what's called the complex domain, it is all accessible. So I'm going to stop there. And if there's any questions or comments, we can take that. We've got about 5 minutes before the class starts. And here's what I expect you will find in class. A historian that's going to be talking about or alluding to particularly the West Point element of this, and this element of the national conspiracy of the intelligence agencies. Okay, let me stop.
Okay. There's quite a lot there. Any questions? I don't see anything on the stream here, Dennis, in the chat. But if there's anything in the room.
is there anything unclear in what I said? Not meaning, oh, do you understand who Krantor is or Leibniz? I understand that can't be clear. We just put these people in. Okay. But I wanted to make sure I read that so that when people go back and read the story again, and then we'll get there next week to talk about all this. But if there's something that was unclear about what I was saying otherwise, please ask that question now or tell me what that was.
Okay, we got somebody coming up.
Not sure. It's not perfectly formulated in my mind, but it seems like if you were going to accept the hypothesis that Poe were an intelligence officer of some sort, an American intelligence officer of some sort, that you would then have to ask the question, why is he specifically concerned with this epistemology? Why is epistemology his concern as an American intelligence officer? This question of mathematics, I think it's intriguing, but it's not what you would generally expect to be the purview of an intelligence officer.
Okay, well, I'm glad that Samantha thought it was clear. I'm glad. I was intended to just be as clear as up to a certain point. See, because we're going to shift over. You're going to hear more about the background of the intelligence thing and why we're saying that and who was in it. I'll name some people who are all in it: Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, Samuel Morse, the Marquis de Lafayette, John Quincy Adams. Okay, and then there's a group of people from Boston also in there. So that's to get that out of the way. But in terms of what was just asked, the place to look at the East India Company and look at the employees of the East India Company. And they include Parson Thomas Malthus, David Hume, Adam Smith, and John Locke, who is, of course, the founder of the Royal Africa Company. Now, Locke in particular, but all of these people are said to be contributors to the founding of the United States, and that the laws are essentially taken from some form of British common law and British traditions. And our argument is that that is not true. Now, Poe, and if you look these people up, they're all called philosophers. Leibniz particularly wrote a book against John Locke called New Essays on the Human Understanding, written against Locke's 600-page Essays of the Human Understanding. So and since Leibniz is the creator of the calculus, we'd have to look in that area, in that direction, to answer this question. Because the real issue is what's meant by Gottfried Leibniz and the relatively, the idea of his relationship somehow to relativistic physics. We have to look at that. We haven't done that. But that's why Poe would have been concerned, because Poe would have known this. It might sound funny. People say, well, why would he have known that? Well, thereby hangs the tale of West Point and what was being taught at West Point. So I'm going to stop there because it's 6:59 basically, and I don't know exactly what Anton Chaikin's going to say. I do know I intend to ask a few questions to see if we can get something out of him. But
Okay,
that's basically it.
all right. Thank you, Dennis, and everyone. You should hop over to the LaRouche Organization YouTube channel so that you can get the part 2 of what Dennis just laid out here. If you want more, and Tony Chaikin will be on that. So that's youtube.com/the LaRouche Organization. Just type in the LaRouche Organization in the search bar and it should come up for you. And with that, we are out. Thank you, Samantha, for getting on as you.